So, I'm here to talk about the psychology of misinformation. I don't think you will need much convincing that misinformation matters. Misinformation is one of the reasons why the public underestimate the scientific consensus on climate change, for example. So basically in the talk, I'll do two things. I'll explain why misinformation is a problem from a specific perspective, my perspective of a cognitive psychologist, and cognitive psychology dealing with memory, reasoning, decision-making, so from that kind of angle, and then how we deal with it. Rod's already mentioned the debunking handbook. I'll show a picture of that later on. So much of what I say is going to be summarized there. Okay, so the focus of my work is, and this is hopefully the only bit of jargon that I'll throw at you, is what we call the continued influence effect. And that means that people's reasoning, their decision-making, will continue to be influenced by misinformation even after they receive corrections of that misinformation. By the way, if you would like me to share these slides, I can happily do so. So there's no need to take notes or anything like that. I'm happy to answer any questions via email and so on and so forth. So yeah, so basically that's the main focus of my work. Why are people continuously influenced by misinformation even after they've received corrections? And they are influenced even when that correction is clear, it's credible, it's repeated, even when they believe the correction initially and later on demonstrably remember the correction. And even in cases where the misinformation is neutral, so where they have no sort of worldview related motivation to not believe the correction, right? So even if we give them fictional stuff about a warehouse fire where they have no motivation, no involvement, we can show that they are continuously influenced by misinformation that is corrected. So it's not an effect that is driven primarily by people's worldview, but it's an effect that happens with all kinds of material. So it's more of a cognitive effect in that people just struggle to update their memory. They struggle to let go of something they once believed. Of course, those motivations and worldviews also play a role, but that's just to say that it's primarily a cognitive effect. Just to give you an example, so we might give people something to read, a little news report or something, an opinion piece. So they get the argument that climate change is caused by solar activity. Then they get a retraction saying, hang on, that's not actually true. There's no evidence for that. And what we find is that they will continue to have greater belief in this link between the sun and climate. And this is just one of many, many examples that we've looked at relative to baseline. So graphically, what that would look like, if you have this no misinformation control condition, some baseline level of belief, if we expose them to this misinformation belief, in the example in the link between the sun and climate, will sort of shoot up. And what we can do with the correction is we can reduce that, but we cannot reduce it back to the baseline, right? So we might halve the effect. It does have, the correction does have some effect, but we don't manage to get the misinformed belief back to baseline. And just one word of caution, this is of course looked at as an average across many, many people. So not everyone will show this effect. Some people will believe and follow the correction. Some people may not be affected by it at all. On average, we see about a halving of the reliance on misinformation in people's reasoning. Now, that was a very sort of explicit piece of misinformation. We can also show effects of misinformation that is much more subtle. For example, this is a transcript of a radio interview done with a few climate scientists. And the gist of this, and this goes on for pages and pages, the gist of it is that climate change is linked to an increased frequency in extreme weather events. That's what this article says, right? But one of the climate scientists makes this rather unfortunate remark, perhaps, that they don't have complete definitive proof that climate change is linked to any particular weather event. And that was enough for the editor in this case to choose a headline that is saying climate change may not be to blame, which in this case is obviously somewhat misleading. And if we look at the effect of that on people's reasoning, if we give them exactly the same article to read, either with a congruent headline or a incongruent headline that is misleading, what we see is that people reading the exact same article just with whether or not the headline is misleading will lead to effects on people's reasoning. People having been exposed to a misleading headline will overestimate threats. They will show reduced support for evidence-based policies. So even these subtle types of misinformation can have an impact. Here's another one, very common in the media, a a false balance, sort of a fake debate where they invite a climate scientist and then, you know, some random person who has an opinion. And we can show that that also, in this case, in John Cook's study, reduced people's perceived expert consensus by about 4 or 5 points. Not a huge, massive effect, but an effect that we can measure. Another example of subtle misinformation is, you know, recent attempts to say, well, we need to focus now on the economy now that we're in this pandemic. Climate change needs to take a back seat, right? And sort of spinning that argument and saying we can only do one or the other, that's also misleading. So what we did earlier this year was we were interested in whether opinion pieces like this that say climate change now needs to take a back seat, we need to focus on the economy, does that actually reduce people's climate change concerns? Might it reduce their support for mitigation? And we find that it does, at least in the US. We've also done it in the UK where it doesn't seem to do that, but in the US, we find that if compared to a control condition, if you give people an opinion piece that says climate change now needs to take a back seat while we focus on the economy, people reduce, with climate change concern, the statistical evidence wasn't that strong, but with mitigation support, we found in 2 studies that such opinion pieces reduced people's support for mitigation. We also tried an opinion piece that said, hey, look, the COVID pandemic has shown that we can flexibly adapt our behavior quickly, and you know, when we're faced with a challenge, this is like a trial run for what we now need to do with climate change as well, and we hope that that might increase people's support for mitigation, but at least in this study we didn't find that. So again, a subtle piece of misinformation that has impact on people's reasoning. And here the blue bars on the right, if we give people a refutation, we say, hang on, you know, this is a false argument. We can do both at the same time. It's not just one or the other. You're being misled here. We can counteract that effect, but again, not fully. Again, our corrections are only partially effective. And in this case, it was actually combined with an inoculation intervention as well. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute or so. So sort of the first take-home message then is that misinformation continues to influence people's reasoning even after they receive clear corrections, and that corrections generally work. So I don't want to be I don't want this to be a pessimistic talk. Corrections do work, so please do go out there and debunk misinformation where you see it. But just be aware you're not going to fully eliminate the impact that misinformation has on people. Okay, so what can we do to improve the effectiveness of these corrections? So one thing you may have noticed with the initial climate myth that I showed was that I just said, look, this isn't true. There's no evidence, right? That's sort of the weakest thing you can do. So just retracting misinformation really is not a particular good way to go about it. At least you should explain why the misinformation is wrong, why it was provided, or why it was believed in the first place. By all means, discredit the source, expose their hidden agenda. So if you say, look, the person who told you this is part of a think tank that is sponsored by the oil industry, you know, that's for an objective person, that's a good argument. And provide alternative facts where you can. Second, make sure you're salient in what you say. Too often we get too complicated, so use clear, simple language, fonts, diagrams. Some of you may have encountered some concerns that we had earlier on where we thought repeating misinformation might be bad because it might boost the familiarity of the misinformation, and that might be a bad thing, and corrections might therefore backfire. We've done a lot of work on that now. We're now pretty sure that repeating misinformation is fine. It doesn't do any damage. But still, we recommend to only repeat it, you know, as often as necessary to make your argument clear. If I want to tell you that the sun doesn't cause climate change, I kind of have to mention the sun and climate change, right? I can't just only focus on carbon dioxide and so on. If someone believes it's the sun, I kind of need to repeat that and bring it up in order to then correct it. So that's fine. Don't be scared of repeating misinformation, but just do it once. Don't do it more often than that. If you do repeat misinformation, it's good practice to warn people beforehand because it prevents them from initially believing it, and because it obviates the need for people to then sort of retrospectively reevaluate what they believed 2 minutes ago. What do I mean with that? Well, this is an example that I found online, which is quite typical of a lot of educational materials, unfortunately, where the intention is to debunk myths, but what they do is they present a question, fact or myth, right, to create suspense or whatever, and then they give you a statement: vaccines cause autism, period, right? And it's like, if you read this and you're naive, you don't really have a lot of knowledge about it, then you might believe it, right? Humans are psychologically primed to believe anything that they're told at first, right? Then they might be skeptical, but at first people assume that what they're being told is true. And then in this particular example, I didn't paste it all in, but there was a long blurb below it, starting with the idea that vaccines caused autism, originated with a dodgy science study. And then there was a long story about that, and only at the very end did they clarify that we now know that vaccines don't cause autism. So you have to read the whole thing to get to the point. It's much better if you just start up front with a warning. Here's some myths. You're warned. It's a myth that vaccines cause autism. You're going to process that much more carefully. Okay, use graphical representations when you have them available, if they facilitate the point you're trying to make, because it's easier for people to understand and have retention of that information, and because specific quantified evidence is harder to counter-argue than vague verbal descriptions. There's one study run by my colleagues in the US, which compared some text, which is very difficult to read, which describes these curves you see on the right, where you have the temperature records of 4 different stations, and you can see that they pretty much in unison trend in a particular way, and you can see exactly how much temperature has changed over what period of time. So it's much harder to counter argue that because it's very specific. Of course, some people might still come in and say, oh, it's all fake data or whatever, right? It's not the silver bullet, but it's much better than a vague verbal description. Make sure you use trustworthy sources. We're just trying to publish a study at the moment with a few studies showing that the trustworthiness of the correction source is very important. So you need to have a trustworthy source for your correction to be effective. But we also show that expertise doesn't seem to matter at all. And that was a pretty hard pill for me to swallow, at least. I would have liked to believe that expertise matters to some extent, that expert words should count for something, but people don't seem to care. They care whether you're trustworthy or not. On the positive side, of course, that means you don't need to be a climate scientist to go out there and debunk climate misinformation, because what really matters is not really your expertise in the domain, but your trustworthiness. Of course, to an extent, you need to have expertise to counter arguments that the opposition might make, right? So if they say it's the sun, of course, if you have expertise and you know why it's not the sun, that's of course helpful. But just in general, for the credibility, or for the effectiveness of the correction, expertise per se doesn't actually matter. It's also a good idea to take worldview and motivations of the audience into account. If you affirm a person's value, it makes them more open to worldview inconsistent information. For example, if you speak to someone about climate change and they're a conservative person, it's usually a good idea, and then I'm probably preaching to the choir here, you probably know this better than I do from experience, that if you focus on the economic costs of climate change or the opportunities that it might present for the economy, it's probably a good idea. Or if you talk to conservatives, one angle that I think can work really well is, because a lot of them are all about freedom, to play the card that actually being misinformed online is sort of violating their freedom to make their own decisions based on a good factual foundation, right? So playing to that sort of angle can be useful, I think. Use social norms. So I refer to an expert consensus that can be very powerful. Everyone or most people get vaccines, or injunctive norms saying that this is just the right thing to do. We have an obligation to do this, and most people agree that this is the right way forward. And those things can facilitate acceptance of corrections, because people don't like to be the odd ones out. They don't want to be socially excluded. Of course, if someone is in a group of science deniers, the opinions of that group are going to be most important to them. But if you're talking to someone who's sort of in the middle, right, who's moderate, that can be a good tool to use. For example, in climate change, even if you talk to conservatives, there's some evidence that norms even in that group are shifting. So pointing out that within the conservative group, there's now more and more people who say, actually, we need to do something about this, and the norms are shifting is, I think, a very powerful thing to do. Does this all work, or am I just giving you my opinion? This is one study where we tested this. We went into a bunch of early child care centers that focus on autism interventions. and we gave professional development to the staff there, and we compared a treatment as usual condition where we corrected a bunch of autism treatment myths, a lot of those are around, using official materials, right? Official training materials. And they're very tentative often. They say, well, there's not a lot of evidence for this treatment, or it has not been proven that this treatment works. When in fact, it has been proven that it doesn't work, or it has even been proven that it does harm. So we contrasted this treatment as usual tentative misinformation correction condition with what we call an optimized debunking approach, which does all the things that I just went through. These are the two groups before the intervention. So the black dots are the means, and the colorful bars here, or violins, show the distribution. So we see broad distribution, surprisingly high support actually for these ineffective treatments. If we give people the treatment as usual debunking, that goes down, which is good to see, but we still see very wide distribution. There's still a few people up in this area above 0.5 who are still very supportive of these treatments. Not a lot of people, but still. And our optimized debunking really squashed that down. So everyone was below 0.4 or whatever this is. And most people go down almost all the way to 0 or even to 0. So that's just some proof that these things work. So take-home message 2, design corrections carefully to maximize effectiveness. And most of this is sort of summarized in our new debunking handbook, which you can download at that address. Just briefly, I talked to Rod last week about, dealing with people who don't want to change their mind, who have misconceptions that serve a purpose because they're worldview congruent. They support people's beliefs, right? Now, again, originally there were fears that if you correct such worldview congruent misconceptions such that the corrections themselves become worldview threatening, that might be a bad thing. It might cause a lot of harm and might backfire and might just ironically strengthen those misconceptions. And again, we've done a lot of research on it, and we're coming closer to a consensus that actually that's not something to worry about too much. It does happen occasionally. We don't fully understand yet when it happens and why it happens. But by and large, the better designed studies and the larger studies have found that it doesn't actually present that much of a risk. So here's an example from a recent study. This was in the political domain. So we gave people misinformation where we said there was a study, and the study had found that either politicians of the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, this was done in the US obviously, were more likely to embezzle public funds. And our participants were either Democrats or Republicans. So for some, that misinformation was worldview congruent. Those are on the left. So that's where we told a Democratic or Democrat participant that the Republicans embezzled most money. And for some people, the misinformation was worldview incongruent. That's on the right. There will be a Democrat where we tell them that it's the Democratic politicians who embezzle more money, right? So the misinformation becomes uncomfortable. And what we see is that the corrections worked, not a huge effect, but they reduced people's misconceptions, and they did so across all conditions equally. So it didn't matter if the misinformation was worldview congruent or incongruent, if you liked the correction or not, it was equally effective. Quite surprising for us because we had previous findings where this wasn't so clear cut. But this seems to be the emerging consensus that worldview doesn't matter as much as we initially feared. But of course it does matter. We know this from experience, and we need to be realistic about what corrections can achieve, because even if we manage to effectively reduce people's misperceptions, specific misperceptions, that doesn't necessarily mean we can change their feelings, their intentions, their behaviors. So with my former student, Brian Iswaya, we ran a study in the US where we fact-checked true and false statements made by Trump or Bernie Sanders, who was at the time the main opponent of Trump. And we found that fact checks reduced misconceptions, again, equally across all conditions. So even Trump supporters reduced their misperceptions when we told them this is something that Trump said, but it was a lie. They reduced their false beliefs. But there was almost no effect on their feelings towards Trump or Sanders or on their voting intentions at all, even if 80% of the statements we presented to them were identified as falsehoods. So we're saying, hey, this is something that Trump said, it was a lie. This is the truth. This is something that Trump said, it was a lie. This is the truth. This was a lie, this was a lie. Here's something he said that was sort of half true. We had a hard time actually finding those things. And here's another lie, right? 80% of them were lies, but people still didn't move in their feelings or voting intentions for Trump. This is just a graphical representation of that. We see a very, very tiny decrease in support for Trump or Sanders. There's two lines here. Didn't matter if it was Trump or Sanders. So people didn't change their feelings towards the candidate, even if they found out they were being lied to all the time. People didn't seem to care at all. Now, thankfully, we also did this in Australia, and the effect in Australia was about 6 times as large. So people in Australia care much more about politicians lying to them, it seems. So that's hopefully some good news. So the last take-home message is that misinformation corrections can only be part of the solution, right? I'm not pretending that my little corrections here can really change the world. They can only make a very humble, small contribution. Other things we can do, we can, and we are increasingly applying inoculation techniques. I mentioned that earlier, where explaining a misleading argumentation technique like cherry picking to someone, or in this example, we explained to people how the tobacco industry used fake experts to promote their products and cast doubt on the assertion that smoking causes cancer and other health problems. So if we explain that to people, if they understand how they're being misled, that can protect them against future disinformation attempts, right? So in the study, we showed that explaining to people how the tobacco industry used the fake expert strategy helped people be more resilient when they were exposed to the same misleading technique in climate change when we showed them the Oregon petition. They were much less likely to be misled by that if they had understood the general principle. And we see the same thing happening now again with COVID, with the Great Barrington Declaration, right? So we're quite hopeful that that can be something really useful to do in the future. But we also need to look a little bit deeper. You know, people who want to misinform you know that repeating disinformation is persuasive, and we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that most disinformation campaigns are not actually designed to ensure that people believe in the false claims. They're designed to confuse people, fatigue them, disengage, polarize, divide, sow uncertainty, and even challenge the very notion that truth is even knowable. If we look to the US, the discussions they're having where they're saying, oh, we don't know anything about climate change. That's in the future. That's unknowable, right? We can't know what's going to happen in the future. Those kind of arguments, I think, are really, really dangerous, and we need to sort of fight back against those. If we do have a person who does not even acknowledge that there's some need for basic sort of common ground based on evidence and facts that is mutually shared and can be a basis for policymaking. So if we can't agree on a basic set of facts, you know, how can we then decide how to move forward? I recommend not engaging with those people because it's just not worth it. If you ask someone what evidence is going to change your mind and they say nothing, you should trust them, believe them, and just walk away. I don't think engaging with those people is very fruitful. But do call them out, because I think this is a very direct attack on democracy, right? It undermines democracy. So I think these people need to be called out. You need to say, hey, what you're doing here is just causing division. You know, we need to get back to agreeing on a basic set of facts and then have a discussion on how we move forward. What you're doing here is not helpful. There's a lot of things other than misinformation corrections that we need to do. I could talk a long time about education and technological solutions. Obviously, I don't have the time to do that today. We also need to acknowledge and address some societal factors. So I think anything we can do to counter inequality, which drives people's belief in conspiracy theories and misinformation and so on, anything we can do to counteract declining trust in institutions and science is going to be valuable. And again, I always, if I see scientists committing fraud, if I see politicians engage in corruption, I think the damage they're doing to public trust is going to have ripple effects that are so strong that it sometimes makes me despair. But that's why I'm really glad to go out and talk to groups like yourself, because I'm keen to also present us or science as made up of people who come out and speak to others. So yeah, again, really thank you for having me. Weakening monopolization of the media, anything we can do to strengthen an independent and diverse media is going to be important. And we need more regulation, especially social media platforms, because what they're doing at the moment, it really is the Wild West. And I hope we look back on this era in 2 or 3 decades and say, thank goodness we're not in that space anymore. But also things like political donations and people like Clive Palmer taking over big campaigns and changing the outcomes of elections. all these things are going to be important, not just correcting misinformation. And I'll stop there. Just to have a picture that people sometimes, I'm not into these things, but my son is a big fan of these characters. I couldn't even name half of them. But the point I'm trying to make is that, you know, many different people need to work together to solve this problem. And if you're interested more in this whole post-truth thing and our thinking on that, here's a paper that I think is relatively easy to access. Like all my papers, they're available on my lab website there. But any questions or any requests, just email me, and I'm happy to send you anything you might need or want. So thanks again for having me. Yeah, it's been an honor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ullrich. That was really, really good. And lots of questions will come up, I'm sure, and one's coming up from me straight away. And it's really interesting listening to what you were saying. It sounds like you use the medical idea of inoculation, but what I'm hearing is that our minds are very easily infected, and what we're talking about here is a kind of an infection. And I've just been part of a workshop where we've been talking about anti-Semitism and how that can infect people's minds, and so these things are really, really powerful. And so I'm delighted to hear a lot of your thinking about that. But I guess my main question is, now that you understand all this and you've got some clear data and clear thinking about it, I wonder what makes you hopeful about us being able to counter this stuff?
Okay, well, there's a couple of things. First of all, when we first started, some of the initial findings were very sobering. As I said, you know, we were very concerned about corrections potentially backfiring because they boost familiarity of the misinformation, or because they rub people the wrong way if you know, people don't like the correction. And we were very concerned about those backfire effects. But 90% of the work that we've done over the last 10 years has shown that we shouldn't worry too much about them. So one of the studies I just ran was, well, can misinformation corrections perhaps spread misinformation to new audiences who haven't encountered it before? That's a claim that people have made, and we find absolutely no evidence for that. So I think people actually behave, and you know, continuously being affected by something that you read is actually not as irrational as it sounds, right? Because it's hard for people to distinguish what comes from an expert source, what is credible. So they're just trying their best to sort of make up their mind in a very noisy and overloaded environment, right? But the way they're behaving is not all that entirely irrational. And often, you know, we hear an argument and someone debunks it, but actually the argument turns out to be true in the end. So it's quite rational to not give it up entirely. So the fact that we consistently see the corrections work to an extent is actually encouraging. And I think I was also too pessimistic in earlier presentations. I was part of a WHO conference where I talked about some of these things. And there were a few people in the audience who were at the coalface as GPs or you know, public health officials. And they said, I wouldn't be so pessimistic. I convince people to get vaccinated or their children vaccinated on a daily basis. They come in and they're skeptical and they heard this and they heard that and they don't want to and they're not sure. But if you have an open ear and you talk to them, you listen to their concerns, you take them seriously, you show them the evidence, we change people's minds all the time, right? Not everyone, we're not always successful, but we can. And it's like a marathon. You know, you got to be in it for the long haul and try again and again and again. And you're not going to change someone's mind completely from one day to the next, but you can have impact. And sometimes you only see the impact after a long period of time, but you can have impact. Now, of course, if you guys are lobbying politicians, they come in and they have, you know, 700 other things that they need to take into account. I think sometimes they get a bit of a hard rap in the media and so on, that, you know, they don't change their mind more readily, but they have so many other constraints in their decision making. They can't always just do what you want or even what they want. I'm not trying to protect them. I think, of course, they need to listen to the science a lot more, and they need to be more proactive in what they do, and not listen to the people where they take most money from, which is why I said we need to look into political donations and so on. But I think even there, they can change their minds. Even if they're not going to admit to it openly, even if they're not going to implement it tomorrow. I just think we need to continuously raise it. So I'm if I say I'm optimistic, that would be a lie. But I'm also not pessimistic, and I think it's worthwhile at least trying. And I can't tell you how much I appreciate groups like you actually going out there and my work is just a tiny little cog in the whole machine. But if I can help you guys just a little bit in some of your conversations, then I'd be very happy. And I think it's the work that you do is really, really important. And I think in the long run, it will make a difference. Now, of course, it may also be like we've seen with lung cancer, right? And smoking. It took 30 years for real change, at least in the Western world. If you look to Asia and Africa now, it's still very despairing, but it took a long time for politicians to change. And in the end, I think what drove it most was maybe not the science, but that the evidence could no longer be denied that people were dying of lung cancer, right? So the more catastrophes we see, the more more bushfires we see, the more people will struggle to actually deny it, right? And that's, I hope we don't need to wait as long until it's too late and say, well, it's now undeniable, so now we need to do something about it. Obviously, we need to act sooner than that.
That's a great answer. Thanks, Ullrich. That makes a lot of sense. We're open for questions from other people. I just checked the chat. It doesn't seem to be any particular questions in there. So we'll take a few verbal questions, and be aware that I won't necessarily see you on the screen because there are two screens of people. Who would like to ask a question of Ullrich? Jane.
Is there a bit of hope in the sense that people believe the first thing they hear? So I suppose if they hear climate change is real, then that's going to be the seed idea in their brains.
I don't actually believe that is true. I don't think people always believe the first thing that they hear. In fact, we have quite a bit of evidence that the last thing that they hear is more important than the first thing that they hear. Of course, you're right in that especially as a child, if you grow up and you're just presented with this is the fact, we all agree this is what's happening, then you establish a belief, and it's going to be difficult to change that, right? So you're right in that sense. But in terms of addressing these misconceptions and so on, the last thing people walk away with often is more influential than the first thing. So both things are important. I think the first thing is important when people build a belief system. So if someone is naive or it's a child, I think it's important to get the message out there early. As I said earlier, explaining to people what kind of misinformation they might encounter in the future, what kind of argumentation techniques are going to be used on them in the future can be protective. So in that sense, it makes a lot of sense to get out there early and put that message front and center. But yeah, keep in mind, even if someone has heard the bad stuff first, you can still change their mind, because recent information is very important in people's thinking. So yeah, I hope that kind of answers the question.
Thanks. Yes, I'm interested in writing letters to the paper and trying to counter the constant denialist letters that we get in there.
Yeah, well, in that case, I would recommend starting with the message that you want people to remember and ending on it as well.
Okay.
Right? Larkov calls that the truth sandwich. We actually find that that's a nuanced issue. We're still figuring out what really the impact is of order. Actually, I think the order doesn't matter too much. Your arguments is what matters, right? But if you were writing a letter and if you have a sticky fact that you can communicate in 5 words that is really, something you want to highlight, then by all means put that first front and center, right? But if you're trying to debunk a particular myth, so it's not primarily about highlighting a fact, but it's primarily about debunking a particular myth, then it can actually it doesn't really matter, but it might actually work best if you say, you know, there was some misleading information here. This was the myth, and now I'm going to tell you why it's wrong. So you don't necessarily have to have like a very rigid template where you think, no, I must start with a fact. That's not true. Start with a thing that is sort of most sticky. If you have a sticky fact, like 97% of scientists agree that there's, you know, man-made global warming. That's sort of a very sticky tidbit that you can put front and center as the first piece of information. If your argument is more nuanced and you want to debunk a particular myth, then start with, you've been misled. This is a myth. Now I'm going to tell you why it's wrong. Does that make sense?
Thanks.
Terrific. Thank you. Marie, you had a question.
Thanks, Rod. Thanks, Ullrich. Really interesting. I put an article in the chat that I read just this weekend in the Sydney Morning Herald, which really aligns with this. So I don't know whether you had a chance to read it, but it talked about cultural values, and it was like, no matter how much you tell people the truth, if it doesn't align with their cultural values. So I just wondered if you had done any studies around the cultural values of, say, conservatives whose values might be, as the article said, that, you know, renewables threaten jobs, they're subsidised, they'll raise energy prices, versus the reality and the opportunities around renewables to create more jobs and lower energy prices. So did you know of any research that sort of looks at those two messages and how the attention to the cultural values can actually change people's opinions and minds?
Yes and no. So not that specific example with renewables, but in general, I think there's evidence that if you take those values into account in the way you frame your argument, I think that can be valuable, because if you start with the wrong keywords, then people will just shut off, right? If you have the word tax, people are just going to go la 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 la. I don't want to hear about that, right? So I think that it can be really important to make sure you actually have an open conversation, right? But it's certainly true that those group values are so important to us as social beings that even if someone, I actually think that a lot of the climate skeptics know the evidence. They know what's going on, right? They can't say it out loud. They can't, right? So what do you do with those people? As I said, you can change their misperceptions. You can convince someone that it's not the sun, but is that going to translate into policy action for renewables? Probably not. As long as that person is in that kind of space where these are their values, that's not going to happen. So I think the best lever there is really to point to the slowly changing values and say, you know, you can be conservative and still support renewable energy, right? It needs to, you need to sort of minimize that cognitive dissonance that those people will experience, allowing them to actually take that step. And usually that will only happen if you have someone sort of on the inside slowly taking them in that direction. If you come from the outside as a scientist or as an activist, or right, it's just not going to happen. That's why I said we need to be realistic about what we can achieve. What we need to do is provide them with enough ammunition and enough convincing evidence that those small changes of misperceptions translate into a change of social norms, even in that group. And that will probably be a process that happens very, very slowly for a very long time. But at some point, that's my hope at least, there will be a tipping point where maybe it goes very quickly. And that might depend on, you know, the next leader of the, in our case, the Liberal Party or the Conservative Party of the day, having a more proactive stance. And yeah.
Thank you, Ullrich. That's we're very hopeful about tipping points as well in a lot of the work that we're doing. There's a question come through from Janine. Have you done any study about the Greenpeace report that showed the misinformation the Murdoch press put out during the Black Summer bushfires that debunks climate change and put the cause into backburning?
No.
Has that been part of your study? No.
No.
Okay.
I mean, I have to say, I chose a few climate change relevant examples. and obviously it's something I care deeply about, but in my work, I use examples from many, many different domains because I'm more interested in the cognitive mechanisms of how we deal with this, right? So I look at political information, health, misinformation, and there's so much out there that, it's a big smorgasbord of things to choose from. And no, I mean, I have used or referred to that particular piece of misinformation in some of my sort of public outreach work and blogs and so on where I've written, but I haven't actually made it the subject of the study, and I'm not aware of, unfortunately, most of this work or any work happens outside of Australia, so it's not a particular focus.
That's fine, and we've got time for one more question. And Rowan, I think you had your hand up, and you're muted at the moment. Rowan, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry, it was a comment rather than a question. So if anybody...
Oh, that's dangerous.
Step back to them.
Has anyone else got an urgent question? Thanks for your honesty, Rowan.
The comment was like, there's this really good marketing book called Influence by a fellow called Robert Cialdini, and he talks about this really strong motive that people have, and that's to conform. And what he talks about is that when people see themselves as part of groups, and what they're actually going to do is driven really strongly by how they perceive other people in their group are behaving, and what they and they do what makes them comfortable, which is to conform with what they think the group is doing. So,
there's some remarkable work in that area, very old work actually, where if you get people in groups and you show them a line or two lines and ask them which one is longer, and all the other people of the group are Confederates and there's only one participant, and everyone says the shorter line is longer, then a lot of people then also say the shorter line is longer. Even you can, right? So you see the lines, you see which one is, but if everyone else says then you think, oh, it must be something wrong with my eyes today or something, and right? And you can that translates into those more reasoning style, decision-making style processing as well, that we can show that if you believe the majority thinks this way, that will shift your beliefs and your belief expressions. The really dangerous thing, and that's another thing we can do, is that there's a very vocal minority out there making a lot of noise, and they think they're the majority, and other people overestimate their size because they make so much noise and think their own views aren't as important. We just ran a study where we asked people about their views of a possible COVID future and what they want. And most people want something that is more equitable, has less inequities, less more pay for essential workers, a greener future, and so on. But if you ask them, what do you think other people want? Everyone wants to just go back to normal and do the same thing we did before. But if you look at the data, the majority don't want that. So you have what we call pluralistic ignorance, where the majority wants something but thinks they're in the minority. That's another reason why we need to speak up more often and say, you guys over there make a lot of noise, but actually you're just 10% of the people. 90% of the people actually want to go this way. And we're not making as much noise, but we are the majority, and build some empowerment through that if you want a more equitable, greener future, you are the majority by far, right? And that needs to be communicated as well to shift those norms a little bit, because they are very powerful, I agree.
Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to our CCL channel by hitting the button in the top left-hand corner of this screen. Spread the word of CCL by using the share icon to as many of your contacts as possible. Thank you. See you next video.